There is a moment that happened to Better Call Saul 53 separate times. The cast arrives dressed for the biggest night in all of television, sitting among people who made the finest work of their lives. A name is read aloud. The name is never theirs. They smile, they clap, and they go home with nothing. 53 nominations, 0 wins. The most honored loser in the history of the Emmys. The strangest part is that almost no one was surprised, because the show had spent 6 years being exactly this. Brilliant in a way that never made a sound. A story about a man starved for recognition, somehow starved of it in real life too. While its parent series became a phenomenon and conquered the entire culture, this quiet spin-off was busy doing something much harder. It was getting better, slowly, patiently, without applause. Tonight, over the next 2 hours, the full case for the student who quietly surpassed the master. Welcome to Between the Episodes. Let's get started. Section 1. The assignment nobody thought could work. Television has a long and slightly embarrassed memory when it comes to spin-offs. For most of the medium's history, a spin-off carried a faint smell of desperation, a sense of a network standing over a finished hit and trying to wring a little more life out of a world the audience had already said goodbye to. Sometimes a side character got promoted to the center of a new show. Sometimes a setting was kept and the faces were swapped. Now and then one of these experiments worked, but the far more common outcome was a polite failure. A series that ran for a season or two on the goodwill of the original before quietly disappearing. By the early part of the last decade, the word spin-off had become a warning more than a promise, and most serious viewers had learned to expect very little whenever one was announced. It was into exactly that climate of low expectations that AMC made an announcement few people knew how to take seriously. The network said it intended to build an entire series around Saul Goodman, the fast-talking criminal lawyer from Breaking Bad. The news landed in 2013, only months after Breaking Bad had finished its final season. And the timing alone made the whole idea feel risky in a way that is hard to overstate now. Breaking Bad had not simply ended. It had ended as one of the most discussed and most admired dramas in the history of the form. A show that had grown season after season into a genuine cultural event. The kind of program that strangers talked about at work and that critics ran out of superlatives describing. Following something like that was already a tall order. Following it with a comedy lawyer seemed, to a great many people, like a mistake waiting to happen. To understand why, it helps to remember who Saul Goodman actually was on Breaking Bad. He arrived partway through the original show as a strip mall attorney with garish suits, cheap television commercials, and a small inflatable copy of the Constitution standing in the corner of his office. His function in the story of Walter White was clear and limited. He greased the wheels. He knew which palms to fill and which corners to cut, and he supplied a steady current of dark comic relief in a series that was otherwise sinking deeper and deeper into dread. Audiences loved him precisely because he was light. He was the character who broke the tension, the one who could make a scene about money laundering feel almost playful. Nobody watched Breaking Bad and came away thinking that this man, of all the people in that world, was carrying a hidden tragedy that deserved 60-odd hours of its own. The man playing him made the proposition stranger still. Bob Odenkirk had spent most of his career in comedy. He had written for sketch shows and late night. He had built a cult reputation through absurdist comedy work in the 1990s, and he was known, when he was known at all, as a clever comic mind rather than a dramatic lead. Asking him to anchor a 1-hour drama in the shadow of Bryan Cranston, an actor who had just delivered one of the most celebrated television performances of the century as Walter White, struck a lot of observers as a gamble bordering on reckless. The history of comedians moving into heavy drama is full of cautionary tales, and there was no obvious reason to believe this would be one of the rare successes. The two men behind the project knew all of this perfectly well. Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad, and Peter Gould, a writer who had been with that show for years, were the ones who decided Saul deserved a fuller story. Gould in particular had a personal claim on the character, because he had written the Breaking Bad episode that introduced Saul Goodman in the first place. The two of them did not stumble into the spin-off out of obligation. They had become curious about a question the original series had no room to answer. Breaking Bad showed the finished product, the slick fixer who already knew every angle. What it never showed was how a person becomes that. The spin-off was their attempt to walk backward into the life of the man, to find out who he had been before the loud suits and the bad commercials, and to discover what had to break inside him for Saul Goodman to exist at all. That curiosity ran straight into the oldest obstacle in the spin-off playbook. A side character built for comic relief is not obviously the foundation of a serious drama, and history offered very few examples of a minor figure being expanded into something that rivaled the parent show. The safe prediction, the one most people quietly made, was that this would be a pleasant footnote. It might run a couple of seasons on the strength of the Breaking Bad name, deliver a few enjoyable callbacks, and then close up shop without ever stepping out of the larger show's shadow. Almost nobody, inside the industry or out of it, walked in expecting the spin-off to become a real argument about which of the two shows was greater. There was a second problem buried underneath the first, and it was in some ways the harder one to solve. A prequel about a known character has a built-in trap, because the audience already knows where the road ends. Anyone who had seen Breaking Bad knew that Jimmy McGill would survive long enough to become Saul Goodman. They knew he would meet Walter White. They knew he would prosper for a while in the criminal underworld of Albuquerque. And they knew, roughly, the shape of the life waiting for him. The usual engine of drama, the simple question of what happens next, was missing before a single scene had been filmed. Whatever this show was going to be, it could not rely on surprise about the broad outcome, because the broad outcome had already aired years earlier. Gilligan and Gould did something with that limitation that, in hindsight, signaled how seriously they were taking the whole enterprise. Rather than hide from the ending, they opened the series even further into the future than Breaking Bad had ever gone. The very first thing the audience sees in the first episode is not Jimmy McGill, the struggling lawyer. It is a tired man in black and white, working the counter of a Cinnabon in a shopping mall in Omaha, living under a new name, glancing over his shoulder, haunted by something he cannot outrun. That cold opening told viewers, before the prequel had even begun, exactly how low this story would eventually drag its hero. The man would not only become Saul Goodman, he would lose even that identity and end up hiding in a food court, afraid of being recognized. The show handed away the ending of the ending in its opening minutes, and then asked the audience to care anyway about every step in between. Asking an audience to care when they already know the destination is a far harder craft than building suspense from scratch. And the early episodes made clear that the creators intended to earn that care slowly. The pilot, an episode simply called Uno, moved at a pace that had almost nothing in common with the propulsive opening of Breaking Bad. It lingered on small humiliations. It watched Jimmy haggle over tiny legal fees, scrape by as a public defender, and stew in resentment toward the prestigious law firm that seemed to look down on him. For long stretches, it felt less like a crime drama and more like a study of a man at the bottom of his profession, grinding out a living and pretending the grinding did not hurt. Only at the very end did the episode reach toward the familiar danger of the Breaking Bad world, when a routine scam went wrong and Jimmy found himself staring down Tuco Salamanca, a cartel figure fans already recognized. The message of that closing scene was careful and deliberate. The cartel was out there, The old world was waiting, but this show was going to take its time getting there. The early episodes planted seeds whose importance would not be obvious for years. A colleague named Kim Wexler appeared from the start, sharing cigarettes and quiet loyalty with Jimmy, though nothing in those first hours announced how central she would eventually become to the entire meaning of the series. The polished lawyer Howard Hamlin was positioned to look like the smooth, dismissive antagonist standing between Jimmy and the success he wanted. And for a long while, the show let that impression stand.
The real source of Jimmy's pain was being kept in shadow, hidden behind the more obvious villain, waiting to be revealed. The patience of this construction was easy to mistake for slowness, and some early viewers did exactly that. Critical reaction in those first months reflected the uncertainty. A good deal of the early writing about the show was warm but cautious, praising the craft and the performances while wondering aloud whether a deliberately slow character study could sustain itself over the long haul. Some critics noted the show's unusual willingness to sit inside ordinary moments and stretch time, treating that quality as a strength. Others were more reserved, unsure whether a prequel about a lawyer could ever generate the heat of the original. The comparison was unavoidable and not always flattering, in part because the standard had been set so impossibly high.
A show being measured against one of the most acclaimed dramas ever made was always going to look modest at first glance. The audience, at least at the beginning, showed up in force out of sheer loyalty to Breaking Bad. The premiere drew close to 7 million viewers, a record-breaking number for a cable series debut at the time. Proof that the devotion to Walter White and Jesse Pinkman had carried over to the new story. That figure was a gift and a problem at once. It meant the show had an enormous platform, but it also meant that a vast crowd had arrived expecting the thrills of the parent series. And this was a quieter, stranger, more patient thing than many of them had come to see. Whether that crowd would stay for a slow burn about a failing lawyer and his complicated brother was an open question. And the answer would take years to fully reveal itself. What Gilligan and Gould had really done was set themselves an assignment that bordered on the impossible. They had taken a character invented to lighten the mood, played by an actor known for comedy, and announced their intention to turn him into a figure of genuine tragedy. They had chosen the prequel form, which strips away the easy suspense of an unknown ending, and then doubled down by revealing an even bleaker future in the opening scene. They had followed one of the most respected dramas in television history, inviting the cruelest possible comparison at every turn. By almost every conventional measure, the project was built to disappoint. The smart expectation was a respectable also-ran, a show that would be enjoyed and then gently forgotten, never escaping the gravity of the series that gave birth to it. And yet the early caution of the creators, the refusal to rush, the willingness to bet everything on slow accumulation rather than quick thrills, contained the first hint of what was actually happening. A show this confident in its own patience was not behaving like a cash-in.
It was behaving like a series that believed it had somewhere important to go, and was prepared to take as long as necessary to get there. The audience that stayed, and a growing number of critics, began to sense over time that the assignment nobody thought could work was being completed in front of them, one quiet episode at a time. The question of whether a comic relief lawyer could carry a drama was slowly being replaced by a far more surprising question, one that would hang over the rest of the show's run and beyond. Not whether the spin-off could survive in the shadow of Breaking Bad, but whether it might, against every reasonable prediction, step out of that shadow entirely and stand as the greater of the two. That transformation did not announce itself with noise or spectacle. It crept in through method, through a set of deliberate choices about how a story should be told and how long an audience could be asked to wait. The single most important of those choices was the one that had worried the early skeptics most: the unhurried pace that so many had mistaken for weakness. Before any of the later triumphs could happen, the show had to prove that slowness could be a strength rather than a flaw. And that proof is where the real argument for its greatness begins. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The opening years asked a strange thing of the audience: to care about a man whose ending was already known, told by people who refused to hurry. That refusal looked like a risk at first, even a fault. What it actually was, and how patience itself became the show's quiet weapon, is where the story turns next. Section 2. The patience Breaking Bad never had. Every television show has a relationship with time, even when it never thinks about it directly. Some series treat time as an enemy to be beaten, racing the clock, cutting away the moment a scene has delivered its information, terrified of letting a single second feel slow. Others treat time as a material to be shaped, something that can be stretched, held, and slowed until an ordinary moment begins to carry weight it would never have at normal speed. Most dramas live somewhere in the middle, moving briskly through the dull parts and lingering only on the big ones. The choice a show makes about time is rarely discussed by casual audiences, yet it shapes almost everything about how that show feels to watch. And it is one of the deepest differences between Breaking Bad and the series that grew out of it. Breaking Bad was a show that ran. From its opening minutes, it established a relationship with time built on momentum and escalation. The very first scene threw a middle-aged man in his underwear into the desert behind the wheel of a careening recreational vehicle, a gun in his hand and sirens in the distance. And the series almost never slowed from there. Walter White's story was a chain of decisions and consequences, each one tightening the next, each episode raising the stakes so that the floor never felt stable beneath the characters. The plotting was famously precise, a clockwork of ticking deadlines and narrowing escapes, and that velocity was a huge part of why the show became a phenomenon. It grabbed viewers by the collar in the first episode and refused to let go. And the pleasure of watching it came partly from the sensation of barely being able to keep up. The spin-off made a choice that ran in almost the opposite direction, and that choice was visible from its earliest hours. Where Breaking Bad sprinted, Better Call Saul strolled. It allowed scenes to begin before anything important was happening, and to continue after the important thing had passed. It watched people perform small tasks in full, without cutting away to spare the audience the wait. A character might fill out paperwork, or assemble a device, or sit in a parked car for a long stretch while the camera simply observed. To a viewer trained by the breakneck rhythm of the parent show, this could feel like the new series had forgotten how to move. What looked at first like hesitation, though, was a method. And over 6 seasons, that method revealed itself as one of the show's greatest strengths, rather than a flaw it had failed to fix. The clearest early proof of what the slowness could do arrived in the first season, in an episode that turned away from Jimmy McGill almost entirely to spend its hour with Mike Ehrmantraut. Mike had existed in Breaking Bad as a calm, grizzled fixer, a man of few words who handled problems with quiet competence and very little visible emotion. The spin-off stopped and asked who he had been before all that. The episode, titled 5-0, let Jonathan Banks carry long stretches of screen time with a stillness that most shows would never have the nerve to attempt. It built slowly toward a single scene in which Mike, sitting across from his daughter-in-law, finally explained what had happened to his son, a police officer, and revealed the guilt he carried for the part he believed he had played in his son's death. The power of that scene did not come from a twist or a chase. It came from the patience the episode had shown in getting there.
from the long silences and small gestures that made the eventual confession land like a weight dropping. A faster show could not have earned that moment, because the moment was made entirely of accumulated time. That same patience defined the way the series handled its sense of process. Better Call Saul became known for long montages in which characters did their work in close, loving detail. Jimmy filming his own low-budget television commercials, hustling to find clients, slowly building a reputation through cheap stunts and clever scams. In the later seasons, after he had taken the name Saul Goodman, an extended montage showed him selling disposable phones to a growing crowd of criminals from the trunk of his car, the camera observing the small ritual of the transaction over and over until the audience understood, without a word of explanation, exactly what kind of practice he was building. The show trusted images and repetition to tell its story, and it trusted viewers to sit with those images long enough to absorb their meaning. The information could have been delivered in a single line of dialogue. The series chose instead to let it unfold in real, observable time, because the watching was the point. Mike's half of the show offered the same pleasure from a different angle. Some of the most admired sequences in the entire series were built around him doing almost nothing at all, or rather doing slow, careful, deliberate things in near silence. In one long stretch, he discovers a tracking device hidden on his car and works out, patiently and without dialogue, who placed it there and what to do about it. The tension in scenes like that came not from speed, but from precision, from watching a careful man think and act in a world where a single mistake could be fatal. The show treated competence as drama. It found suspense in the quiet steps a professional takes to stay alive, and it refused to rush through those steps for the sake of a quicker thrill. The most extreme expression of this patience came in the 5th season, in an episode called Bagman, directed by Vince Gilligan himself. The setup was simple. Jimmy was sent into the desert near the Mexican border to retrieve a large sum of cash on behalf of the cartel figure Lalo Salamanca. The retrieval went wrong. An ambush left him stranded, and Mike arrived to protect him. What followed was close to 40 minutes of two men crossing a brutal, sun-blasted landscape on foot, dragging the money behind them, running out of water, hunted and exhausted. For long passages, almost nothing was said. The episode let the heat and the distance and the silence do the work, watching Jimmy deteriorate from a smug operator into a desperate, sunburned wreck, eventually reduced to drinking from a punctured water container held above his head to catch the last drops. A show with no patience could never have built an hour like that. The episode was a bet that an audience would follow two characters through emptiness and tedium, and come out the other side feeling something close to having survived it themselves. And the bet paid off, because the series had spent years teaching its viewers how to watch slowly. The slowness did something else, something the early skeptics had not anticipated. And this is where the prequel form quietly turned from a weakness into an advantage. Because the audience already knew the ending, because everyone watching understood that Jimmy McGill would eventually become Saul Goodman and then end up hiding in that Omaha mall, the show's patience converted foreknowledge into dread. Every slow scene was shadowed by what the viewer already knew was coming. A quiet, hopeful moment between Jimmy and the people he loved did not play as simple warmth. It played as the calm before a collapse the audience could already see on the horizon. The slowness gave that dread room to grow. A faster show would have raced past the small human moments and rushed toward the transformation. But the spin-off lingered exactly on the things that would soon be lost. And the lingering made the loss feel inevitable and almost unbearable. The known ending, which should have drained the tension out of the story, instead poured tension into every patient frame. This was a fundamentally different kind of suspense than Breaking Bad had offered, and arguably a more difficult one to sustain. Breaking Bad asked what would happen. Better Call Saul asked how, and why, and at what cost. And it answered those questions in slow motion. The original series generated its tension from uncertainty about the future. The spin-off generated its tension from certainty about the future, from the gap between the decent man on screen now and the broken one the audience knew he would become. Holding an audience with the second kind of suspense requires far more confidence and far more craft, because there is no cheap surprise to fall back on. The only tool available is the steady, patient accumulation of small moments until the weight of them becomes overwhelming. The patience paid a further dividend in the depth of the show's people. Breaking Bad developed Walter White and Jesse Pinkman with extraordinary care. But its breakneck pace left less room for the figures around them, and several supporting characters remained sketches rather than full portraits. The slower rhythm of the spin-off allowed it to develop a much larger group of people, to a level of detail the original rarely reached. Jimmy was fully drawn, but so was Kim Wexler. So was his brother Chuck. So was the polished lawyer Howard Hamlin. So was Mike. So was the cartel enforcer Nacho Varga. And so were the figures who had crossed over from Breaking Bad and were now given interior lives they had never been allowed before. The extra time brought extra dimension. Each character became a person with a history, a set of contradictions, and a logic of their own, rather than a function in someone else's plot. A show in a hurry cannot do that for so many people at once. A show willing to wait can, and the spin-off used its patience to build one of the richest ensembles in television. None of this came without a price, and the price is bound up in the very word at the center of this story. A slow show is a harder sell. It does not produce the constant jolts that keep a restless audience glued to the screen, and it does not generate the loud, immediate excitement that turns a series into a water cooler sensation overnight. The patient craft that critics came to admire was the same quality that made the show easy to overlook for viewers who wanted a faster ride. The early audience that had arrived out of devotion to Breaking Bad gradually thinned, and the series settled into a quieter existence, admired deeply by those who stayed and slowly forgotten by those who had drifted away looking for the old velocity. The slowness was the source of its greatness and the reason that greatness spread so quietly. A show this patient was always going to be appreciated in a hush rather than a roar. Looking back across the full run, the patience that worried so many people in the beginning stands as the foundation everything else was built upon. The deep characters, the unbearable dread, the famous set pieces in the desert and the mall and the parking lot. All of it rested on the willingness to slow down and wait. The series understood that time, handled with care, could do things that speed never could, and it spent 6 seasons proving the point. The slowness that looked at first like a failure to match Breaking Bad turned out to be the precise quality that allowed the spin-off to surpass it. Because patience let the show reach emotional places the faster original had no room to go. That patience had to be aimed at something, of course, and in the earliest stretch of the series, it was aimed not at the cartel or the law, but at a single relationship that sat at the very heart of who Jimmy McGill was. Before the desert, before the phones, before any of the crime, there was a house with the power switched off, and a man inside it who happened to share Jimmy's last name. The slow, careful storytelling found its first great subject in that house, in the long and painful bond between two brothers. And that bond is where the real tragedy of the show begins. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show built its power not on speed, but on stillness, turning a known ending into slow dread and giving a whole ensemble room to breathe. That patience needed a heart to beat around, and it found one early, inside a darkened house. The story of the two brothers who lived there is where the tragedy truly starts. Section 3. The Brother Problem. The oldest rivalries in human storytelling are not between heroes and villains or armies and kingdoms. They are between brothers. Long before television existed, the deepest dramas were often domestic ones, set inside families where love and resentment grew from the same root and could not be pulled apart. A brother knows where the soft spots are.
A brother remembers who you were before you became whoever you were pretending to be. A brother can wound in ways a stranger never could, because a brother's judgment carries the weight of a lifetime. When a story reaches into that kind of relationship and tells the truth about it, the result can be more devastating than any shootout. And it was into exactly that territory that Better Call Saul walked in its earliest seasons, long before the cartel money and the desert and the disposable phones became the center of attention. At the heart of the show stood two men who shared a last name and almost nothing else. Jimmy McGill was the younger of the two, a former small-time con artist from Cicero, Illinois. A man who had spent his youth running petty scams and slipping on icy sidewalks for insurance payouts, earning the nickname Slippin' Jimmy. Charles McGill, known to everyone as Chuck, was the older brother, and he was the opposite of Jimmy in nearly every way that mattered to the world. Chuck was brilliant, disciplined, and respected. A celebrated attorney whose name sat on the door of one of the most prestigious law firms in Albuquerque. The firm was called Hamlin, and McGill, and the M at the end of it was Chuck. Where Jimmy was charming and reckless, Chuck was rigorous and cold. Where Jimmy bent rules instinctively, Chuck treated the law as something close to sacred. They were bound together by blood and by history, and that binding was the source of the show's first and arguably its greatest tragedy. Chuck was also, by the time the series begins, a deeply troubled man. He suffered from a condition he called electromagnetic hypersensitivity, a belief that his body reacted painfully to electricity and to the invisible fields given off by modern devices. He kept his house dark and unpowered, lit only by gas lanterns, and he wrapped himself in a reflective emergency blanket to shield himself from what he believed was radiation. Visitors had to leave their phones and car keys in a metal mailbox outside before they could enter. The illness has no accepted basis in medical science, and the show is careful to present it as something other than a genuine physical disorder. Over time, the series makes clear, through the behavior of the doctors and lawyers around him, and eventually through events Chuck cannot explain, that the condition lives in his mind rather than in his nerves. That careful framing matters because Chuck's illness becomes the lever that eventually destroys him, and the show never lets the audience forget that the affliction is, at its core, a psychological one. Jimmy's entire arc in the early seasons is shaped by a single desperate wish, the wish to earn his brother's respect. He had clawed his way out of the mailroom at Chuck's firm and studied law in secret through a distant correspondence school, the University of American Samoa, passing the bar exam after repeated failures. He had done all of this in large part to become the kind of man Chuck could be proud of, to stand beside his brother as a fellow lawyer rather than as the family embarrassment. He took care of Chuck during the worst of the illness, buying groceries, carrying ice, sitting with him in the dark, performing the small daily acts of devotion that a loving brother performs without being asked. Underneath every scam and every shortcut Jimmy pulled, there was a man hungry for one thing that money could not buy: the approval of the person who had known him longest. The cruelty at the center of the show is that this approval was never coming, and that Jimmy did not know it. For most of the first season, the obstacle in Jimmy's path appears to be Howard Hamlin, the polished and faintly condescending partner
who keeps blocking Jimmy from a job at the firm. The audience, like Jimmy, is led to read Howard as the villain, the smooth operator standing between an ambitious man and the success he has earned. The truth, when it finally arrives, is far worse and far more intimate. In an episode near the end of the first season, Jimmy discovers that Howard was never the real obstacle. The person quietly keeping him out of the firm, the person instructing Howard to hold him back, was Chuck. His own brother had decided that Jimmy could never be a real lawyer, that he would always be Slippin' Jimmy underneath the suit, and that handing him the power of the law would be like handing a dangerous tool to a person who could not be trusted with it. Chuck did not see a brother who had worked hard to change. He saw a con man with a law degree, and he believed that protecting the profession meant keeping Jimmy as far from it as possible. That revelation reframed everything that had come before. The years of care, the groceries, the ice, the nights in the dark. All of it had been given to a man who, behind the gratitude, held his younger brother in quiet contempt. The wound was not a single betrayal, but a lifetime of withheld belief, and it cut to a place that no external enemy could ever reach. The show had spent its slow, early hours building the bond between the brothers precisely so that this discovery would land with full force. The patience of the storytelling, the long scenes of Jimmy tending to Chuck, existed to make the betrayal unbearable when it came. A faster show would have rushed the reveal. This one had earned it. The conflict escalated from there into something that looked, from a distance, almost like a war fought with paperwork. And yet it carried more emotional violence than most actual fights on television. Jimmy, stung and furious, eventually struck back at his brother in a way that crossed a clear legal line. To sabotage Chuck and help a client connected to Kim Wexler, he secretly altered numbers on a set of legal filings at a copy shop, changing details so that Chuck would appear to have made a careless and damaging mistake on an important banking case. The forgery was a felony, and it was also a deeply personal blow, an attack on the one thing Chuck prized above all else, his reputation for precision and competence. Chuck, whose mind was as sharp as ever even as his condition worsened, quickly deduced that Jimmy was responsible. What Chuck did next remains one of the most chilling demonstrations of how well these two men knew how to hurt each other. He set a trap built entirely out of Jimmy's love for him. Pretending to be broken and defeated, Chuck lured Jimmy into a conversation and let his brother believe that the forgery had pushed him to the edge. Jimmy, unable to watch his brother suffer, confessed everything in an attempt to comfort him, admitting to the crime out loud in order to ease Chuck's pain. He did not know that a recorder was running. Chuck had used the deepest and most genuine thing in Jimmy, his guilt and his love, as bait to capture a confession on tape. The recording turned the brotherly conflict into a legal weapon, and it set the stage for the most extraordinary confrontation in the early run of the show. That confrontation came at a disciplinary hearing before the New Mexico bar, in an episode that ranks among the finest the series ever produced. Chuck intended to use the tape to have Jimmy disbarred and possibly prosecuted. Jimmy and Kim, fighting for Jimmy's career, chose a strategy that was as brilliant as it was merciless. Rather than dispute the contents of the recording, they went after the man who made it. They put Chuck on the stand and slowly drew out the depth of his obsession with his brother and the reality of his fragile mental state. The masterstroke involved Chuck's own illness. Before the hearing, an associate of Jimmy's named Huel had quietly slipped a charged cell phone battery into the breast pocket of Chuck's jacket. For the entire length of the proceeding, Chuck, a man who claimed to be physically incapacitated by the presence of electricity, sat with a live battery against his chest and felt nothing at all. When this was revealed in open court, the foundation of Chuck's credibility collapsed. Cornered and humiliated, Chuck unraveled on the stand. ranting about Jimmy in front of everyone, exposing the full extent of his fixation and the irrational nature of his condition. The lawyer who prized control above all else lost it completely in public, and he did so because his brother had found the one pressure point guaranteed to break him. The victory destroyed Chuck, and it did not leave Jimmy whole either. Chuck's professional standing never recovered. His illness was now a matter of public record. His judgment was openly questioned, and the firm he had helped build began to see him as a liability rather than an asset. In a painful turn, his old partner Howard eventually took on personal debt to buy Chuck out of the firm entirely, pushing the founder out the door in order to protect the business from the risk his condition now represented. For a brief stretch, Chuck seemed to fight back against his illness, confronting the possibility that it was psychological, working to face the modern world he had hidden from, even tearing into the walls of his own house in search of a hidden electrical source he was certain must be there. The recovery did not hold. The end came in the third season finale, and it arrived after one last conversation between the brothers that was, in its quiet way, the cruelest thing Chuck ever did.
Jimmy, still carrying guilt over what had happened, came to make some kind of peace. Chuck refused it in the coldest possible terms. He told Jimmy that there was no need to feel remorse because Jimmy had never truly mattered to him in the first place, that he should stop hurting over the damage he had done because Chuck simply did not care about him. Whether this was the truth or a deliberate lie designed to drive Jimmy away forever, the show leaves deliberately uncertain, and that uncertainty is part of its power. Soon after, alone in his darkened house, Chuck relapsed completely. In the final moments of the episode, he methodically dismantled his home, and then, sitting amid the wreckage, he repeatedly struck the gas lantern beside him until it toppled and the house caught fire around him. The show presents the act as a deliberate one, the end of a man who had run out of ways to live with his own mind, and it remains one of the most quietly horrifying moments in the entire franchise. Michael McKean's performance as Chuck deserves a place in any honest account of why the show reached the heights it did. Like Bob Odenkirk, McKean had built his career largely in comedy. And like Odenkirk, he turned out to be capable of a devastating dramatic register that few would have predicted. His Chuck was never a simple villain. He was a proud, intelligent, frightened man whose love for his brother had curdled into something poisonous. And McKean played every layer of that contradiction without ever asking for sympathy or condemnation. The relationship between the two brothers worked because both actors made it feel like a real and ancient bond, full of history that the audience could sense even when it was never stated. This is the territory where the spin-off first stepped clearly beyond its parent. Breaking Bad had powerful family conflict, the slow poisoning of Walter White's marriage, the agonizing rift between Walt and his brother-in-law Hank. What it never attempted was a sustained, intimate study of sibling rivalry rendered with this much patience and pain. The story of Jimmy and Chuck was domestic and psychological in a way the original rarely was, closer to old tragedy than to crime drama, a portrait of two men destroyed by the gap between the love one of them needed and the belief the other one could not give. Critics reaching for comparisons sometimes called the show's character drama Shakespearean, and the brothers were the clearest reason why. The conflict had no guns and no money at its center. It had only envy, shame, and the wreckage of a relationship that could never be repaired, and it cut deeper than almost anything in the show that came before. Chuck's death did not close the story so much as set the rest of it in motion. The grief Jimmy refused to feel, the guilt he buried, the identity he could no longer bear to carry, all of it pushed him further from the man he had hoped to become, and closer to a new persona that asked nothing of his heart. The death of one McGill made room for the slow disappearance of the other, and that disappearance would be witnessed most closely by the one person the original series had never even mentioned. A woman whose absence from Breaking Bad
would come to feel like the heaviest silence in the entire story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Two brothers, one desperate for belief and one unable to give it, drove the show into a tragedy darker than any gunfight, ending in a darkened house and a fallen lantern. The grief left behind began pulling Jimmy toward a self that felt nothing. Watching it happen was a woman the original series never named, and her absence is where the deepest mystery of the show lives. Section 4. The character who was never in Breaking Bad. Sometimes, the most powerful thing in a story is something that is not there. A gap, an absence, a space where a person should be and is not. Storytellers have always understood that what is left out can press on an audience more heavily than what is shown. That a missing chair at a table says more than a full one. Breaking Bad ran for 5 seasons and followed Saul Goodman through a great deal of his life as Walter White's lawyer. And across all of those hours, one figure was never seen, never named, never so much as hinted at. The prequel would go on to make that figure the emotional center of its entire story. Her name was Kim Wexler, and the simple fact that she did not exist anywhere in Breaking Bad turned out to be the single most devastating creative decision the spin-off ever made. Kim was an invention, a character built from nothing by Vince Gilligan, Peter Gould, and their writers, with no source material in the original series to lean on. That alone is worth pausing over, because the easy path for a spin-off is to coast on borrowed faces, to fill the screen with familiar names and let nostalgia do the work. Better Call Saul did bring back many figures from Breaking Bad over time, but the person it placed at the very heart of Jimmy McGill's life was someone the parent show had never met. Building an original character into the soul of a series that already had a beloved roster of returning ones was a risk, and the show took it without hesitation, trusting that a new person, drawn with enough care, could matter more than any cameo. She was played by Ray Seahorn, an actor who was far from a household name when the series began, and who, over 6 seasons, delivered one of the finest sustained performances in modern television.
Seahorn gave Kim a stillness that could hold a scene without a single word, a way of letting thought move across a face that made the audience lean in. Kim was a watcher and a thinker, a woman who weighed her words and kept her feelings under tight control. And Seahorn played that restraint so precisely that the rare moments when Kim's composure cracked carried enormous force. Much of what the show achieved emotionally was built on this performance, on the way a tightening of the jaw or a long silence could carry the weight of a decision being made somewhere deep inside. Kim's history made her sympathetic and formidable at once. She had grown up poor in a small town near the plains, raised by an unreliable mother whose drinking left the young Kim to fend for herself far too early. Out of that hard beginning, she had built a life through sheer discipline. She worked her way up from the mailroom of the same prestigious firm where Chuck was a partner, attending law school at night, paying off her own debts, never once taking the easy way that her circumstances might have excused. By the time the audience meets her, she is a sharp and respected attorney handling serious banking work, with a major client she would eventually carry with her as her own. In her rigor and her devotion to the law, she resembled Chuck. In one crucial respect, she was his opposite. Where Chuck looked at Jimmy and saw a fraud who could never change, Kim looked at Jimmy and saw a man worth loving, flaws and all. The relationship between Kim and Jimmy began the way many of the show's most important things began, quietly and at a slant. They shared cigarettes in the concrete gloom of the firm's parking structure, two people from rough backgrounds who had clawed their way into the legal profession and who understood each other in ways their polished colleagues never could. From those small moments grew a partnership that became the spine of the series, deeper and more believable than almost any romance the parent show had attempted. They were not a perfect couple bound by simple devotion, They were two damaged people who recognized something true in each other, who made each other braver and worse and more alive, all at once. Here the show made its most daring and most intelligent choice, the one that separates Kim from nearly every comparable character in television history. The familiar version of this story is well worn. A decent woman falls for a charming rogue and is slowly dragged down by his bad choices, a victim of his corruption, a conscience he ignores. Better Call Saul refused that easy shape. Kim was not corrupted by Jimmy. She was drawn to the very thing in him that made him dangerous, because the same thing lived in her. The cons thrilled her. The scams, the small acts of trickery against people who deserved it, lit her up in a way that nothing in her disciplined professional life ever did. In an early scene, the two of them work a stranger in a bar together, running a quick con on an arrogant man over expensive drinks. And the look on Kim's face afterward tells the whole story. She is not horrified. She is exhilarated. The honest lawyer who fought for clients nobody else would touch also carried a hidden appetite for getting one over on the world. And the show let those two truths sit inside her at the same time without ever resolving them into something simpler. This made Kim a far more complex figure than the usual partner of a flawed protagonist, and it scrambled the easy moral math the audience might have wanted to do. Across the series, the question of who was leading whom toward ruin remained genuinely open. In several of the most important moments, Kim was the one pushing to go further, the one unwilling to stop, the one who escalated a scheme when Jimmy hesitated. Her darkness was real, and it was her own, not a stain that Jimmy had left on her. That refusal to make her either a saint or a victim is a large part of why so many viewers came to regard her as the richest character in either show. Richer even than the figures the celebrated original had spent 5 seasons developing. The relationship deepened until, in the 5th season, the two of them married, partly for the legal protections that marriage offered, and partly out of something neither of them could fully name. By then, their partnership had taken on a quality that was equal parts love and mutual endangerment. They were happiest when they were scheming together, and their schemes were growing larger and crueler. What had started as harmless tricks on deserving strangers was becoming something with real victims. And the most consequential of those schemes was aimed at a man who had been part of the story since the very first episode. Howard Hamlin had spent years as the smooth, prosperous lawyer who looked down on Jimmy, the face the audience had once mistaken for the show's villain. The truth, by the later seasons, was that Howard was a fundamentally decent man who had been caught in the crossfire of the McGill brothers' war and had genuinely tried to do right by Jimmy more than once. None of that protected him. In the final season, Kim and Jimmy devised an elaborate plan to destroy Howard's reputation, painting him publicly as a man in the grip of a drug problem, sabotaging his standing in order to force the settlement of a long-running case that would deliver a large payday to Jimmy. The cruelty of the scheme is hard to overstate, and the most striking thing about it is how committed Kim was. She was not a reluctant accomplice. She was an architect, arguably more driven than Jimmy himself, unwilling to pull back even as the plan grew more vicious. The scheme worked, and then it collapsed into catastrophe in a way none of them had foreseen. On the night their plan reached its climax, Howard came to Jimmy and Kim's apartment to confront them, to tell them he understood what they had done and what kind of people they had become. He was in the middle of saying it when the cartel figure Lalo Salamanca walked through the door on entirely unrelated business, and, treating Howard as nothing more than an inconvenient witness, killed him without hesitation. Howard died as collateral damage of a con that had nothing to do with the cartel at all. An innocent man destroyed by a scheme designed to humiliate rather than to harm. The mid-season episode that delivered this turn left the audience as stunned as the characters, and it marked the moment when the games Kim and Jimmy had been playing finally produced a body. Howard's death broke something in Kim that nothing else had. The thrill she had chased curdled into horror as she grasped the true cost of who she and Jimmy had become together. After the two of them were forced to help cover up the killing and navigate the terrifying aftermath with the cartel, Kim arrived at a decision that answered the six-season mystery hanging over the entire series. She quit the law. She left Jimmy. She walked away from everything she had built and everything she had loved, telling him that the two of them apart were fine, but that together they were poison to everyone around them. This was the long-awaited explanation for her total absence from Breaking Bad. She had not died, and she had not been imprisoned. She had removed herself, deliberately and completely, judging that her own happiness was not worth the damage the partnership caused. The most painful exit in the show was a choice, made by a clear-eyed woman who understood exactly what she was giving up. That choice is what makes Kim's absence from the original series so heavy in hindsight. For 6 seasons, the audience watched her love Jimmy, scheme with him, marry him, and the whole time a quiet dread sat underneath every scene, because everyone knew she was nowhere to be found in the life he would later live. The dread was never resolved by tragedy in the ordinary sense. It was resolved by a moral reckoning, by a person deciding that the version of herself she became with the man she loved was a version she could not live with. After leaving, Kim built a deadened life far away, working an unremarkable job in Florida, surrounded by beige comfort, having amputated the part of herself that once thrilled at the cons. She survived, but she chose a kind of living death over the dangerous vitality of her old life, and the show treated that choice with the seriousness it deserved. The story did not abandon her there. In the final stretch of the series, carrying years of buried guilt, Kim took a step that few characters in any drama would have the courage to take. She returned to face what they had done to Howard, filing a sworn statement that told the truth about his death to the people he left behind, exposing herself to ruin in the process. That act of conscience, arriving long after she could have simply stayed silent and safe, set in motion the events that would bring her story and Jimmy's back into contact one final time. The full weight of where their separate roads finally led belongs to the end of this story, but it is enough to say that Kim's choice to tell the truth was the moral hinge on which the entire ending would turn. There is a real-world coda to Kim's story that fits the larger theme of this whole account with almost painful precision. For most of the show's run, Ray Seahorn's extraordinary work went without the recognition it so plainly deserved. Despite being singled out by critics again and again as the best thing in a series full of remarkable performances, she was passed over by the major awards for season after season, unnominated while the praise piled up around her. Acknowledgement finally came near the very end of the show's life, long after it should have, in a pattern that would come to define the way the entire series was treated by the institutions meant to honor it. The greatest character the spin-off created was played by an actor the awards world could not be bothered to notice until it was nearly too late. And that quiet neglect mirrors the fate of the show as a whole. When the case is made that Better Call Saul surpassed Breaking Bad, Kim Wexler is the strongest single piece of evidence anyone can offer. She was not borrowed from the original. She was not a familiar face trading on old affection. She was built from nothing, into a person of such depth and contradiction that many viewers came to consider her the finest character either show ever produced. Her absence from Breaking Bad, which began as a structural fact, became the source of the prequel's deepest suspense and its most profound emotional payoff. The original gave the world Walter White and Jesse Pinkman. The spin-off answered with a woman the original never imagined. And in doing so, it proved that it was not merely living off the parents' legacy, but creating something genuinely new and arguably greater. Yet a story this rich in damaged people needed more than its lovers and its brothers. It needed a world for them to move through, a world of danger and money and quiet menace
that connected this small human drama to the larger criminal saga waiting on the horizon. The figures who populated that world, some new and some carried over from Breaking Bad, would prove that the spin-off could build villains every bit as memorable as its heroes, and in some cases, even more so. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A woman the original series never named became its successor's beating heart, an equal partner in love and in ruin whose final absence was a choice rather than a fate. Around these damaged people, the show built a darker world of money and menace. The men who ruled that world, some new and some returning, are where the series proved its villains could rival its heroes. Section 5. A deeper bench of villains. A story is only ever as strong as the forces standing against the people at its center. A hero without a worthy opponent is a man shadowboxing in an empty room, and no amount of charm or tragedy in a protagonist can make up for a thin set of antagonists. The great crime dramas understand this instinctively, which is why so many of them are remembered as much for the people doing harm as for the people trying to survive it. Breaking Bad had understood it too, building a gallery of memorable threats around Walter White, from the volatile street dealer to the chicken restaurant kingpin, who became one of the most admired villains in television history. Any prequel set in the same world inherited both a gift and a burden. The gift was a stable of familiar dangers waiting to be used.
The burden was the knowledge that the audience already knew which of those dangers would survive into the later story, draining away the simple suspense of who would live and who would die. The spin-off handled that inheritance in a way few people expected. Rather than leaning on the old villains as comfortable furniture, the show deepened the ones it borrowed and invented entirely new ones to stand beside them, until its bench of antagonists rivaled and in several respects surpassed the one assembled by the celebrated original. The cartel world of Better Call Saul became a place of real texture and weight, populated by figures who were not simply obstacles, but fully realized people with codes, fears, loyalties, and private griefs. The men who ruled that world proved that the series could build menace as memorably as it could build heartbreak.
The bridge between the two shows was Mike Ehrmantraut, and his transformation across the prequel stands as a quiet masterpiece of character building. In Breaking Bad, Mike had been Gus Fring's calm and lethal fixer, a man of few words who solved problems with grim efficiency and revealed almost nothing of himself. The spin-off stopped to ask who that man had been before, and the answer reshaped him entirely. Mike was a former Philadelphia police officer whose son, also a cop, had been killed by corrupt fellow officers. The guilt that hollowed Mike out came from his belief that his own advice had led to his son's death, that in trying to keep the young man safe, he had instead doomed him. Mike avenged his son, and then fled to Albuquerque carrying that wound. And from there, he drifted into the criminal underworld, telling himself at every step that the money was for his daughter-in-law and his granddaughter.
The justification that he was doing it all for the family became the thread he held onto as he sank deeper, and the show watched with unblinking patience as a decent, broken man rationalized his way into the service of monsters. Jonathan Banks gave the role a stillness that could carry entire scenes, and the prequel turned a supporting tough guy into one of the most fully drawn figures in the entire franchise. If Mike was the bridge, Nacho Varga was proof that the show could build a great character from nothing at all. Nacho did not exist in Breaking Bad in any meaningful sense, and yet he became one of the most tragic figures the series ever produced. He was a sharp, cautious operator inside the Salamanca crime family, an intelligent man who could see clearly that the life he was trapped in would eventually kill him.
Unlike the brutal figures around him, Nacho wanted out. And more than anything, he wanted to protect his father, an honest businessman who ran a legitimate upholstery shop and who had no idea of the violence his son moved through every day. That love for his father was the lever that destroyed Nacho. Because in the world of the cartel, anyone you love is a weakness that more powerful men can squeeze. Nacho also held the answer to one of the small mysteries that connected the two shows. Anyone who had watched Breaking Bad knew the old man in the wheelchair, the silent figure who communicated by ringing a bell, a former cartel boss reduced to a paralyzed shell. The prequel revealed how he got that way, and Nacho was the cause. In an attempt to free himself from the Salamancas, Nacho secretly swapped the old man's heart medication for harmless pills, hoping to trigger a fatal collapse. The collapse came, but it did not kill.
It left Hector Salamanca alive and broken, and it bound Nacho forever to a secret that more powerful men would soon use to own him. When Gus Fring uncovered what Nacho had done, he did not expose him. He used it, forcing Nacho to become a spy inside the Salamanca operation, trapping him between two deadly forces, with his father's life hanging over every decision. Nacho's end was among the most powerful exits the show ever staged. Cornered at last, with the cartel certain to torture and kill him, and with his father's safety the only thing left to bargain for, Nacho chose how he would die. Standing before Hector and the assembled cartel, he refused to grovel. He admitted what he had done, taunted the old man he had crippled, and then, having quietly worked himself free, he seized a weapon and turned it on himself, denying his enemies the satisfaction of killing him slowly and securing, through his death, the safety of the one person he had always been trying to protect.
Michael Mando played the scene with a defiance that turned a doomed man into something close to heroic. And the death of an entirely invented character landed with as much force as the loss of anyone carried over from the original. The old man Nacho had crippled was himself a study in how the prequel deepened a borrowed villain. Hector Salamanca had been a mute, immobile presence in Breaking Bad, terrifying in his stillness, communicating only through a bell. The spin-off showed him before the fall, vital and vicious, a cartel patriarch of genuine menace. And in doing so, it filled in the long blood feud that drove so much of the cartel story. That feud was rooted in an old wound established in the original series. Years earlier, Hector had murdered Gus Fring's partner in front of him, an act of casual cruelty that Gus never forgave and never forgot. The prequel let the audience feel the slow burn of that hatred, and it produced one of the coldest moments in the franchise. After Hector's collapse, it was Gus who arranged for the finest medical care to keep him alive. He did not do it out of mercy. He did it because death would be too kind. Gus wanted Hector to survive, trapped in a ruined body, helpless and humiliated, forced to live on so that he could suffer. The decision to save an enemy in order to prolong his torment told the audience everything about the depth of patience and malice inside Gustavo Fring. Gus himself was the prequel's clearest example of taking a great villain and making him greater. In Breaking Bad, he had been a marvel of control, a respectable businessman hiding a drug empire behind a chain of chicken restaurants. The spin-off deepened that control until it became almost unbearable to watch, while also allowing rare cracks of something human to show through. A long subplot followed the construction of his hidden underground laboratory, the secret facility that fans of the original would recognize. And at the center of that subplot was a German engineer named Werner Ziegler. Gus had brought Werner in to build the lab, and the two men developed something close to mutual respect. When Werner, homesick and weary, slipped away to see his wife, he set in motion his own destruction. Gus could not allow a man who knew his secrets to wander free, and so he ordered Werner killed. The task fell to Mike, who had come to like the engineer, and the show forced its most sympathetic professional to murder a man he respected on the orders of a man he served. The scene was quiet and devastating, and it laid bare the true cost of Gus Fring's world, where loyalty and decency were luxuries that got people killed. The series also dared to show the loneliness underneath Gus's perfect surface. In a rare and striking moment, the show let him linger at a restaurant in conversation with a knowledgeable young sommelier, allowing a flicker of longing and isolation to surface in a man who normally permitted himself nothing. The scene gave nothing away in plot terms, but it deepened the portrait immeasurably, suggesting a private hunger and a profound solitude beneath the iron discipline. The original had given the world a brilliant villain. The prequel gave that villain an inner life, and somehow made him more frightening by making him more human. The crown jewel of the prequel's villain craft, though, was a man conjured almost entirely out of a single line from the original series. Anyone who remembered Breaking Bad might recall a brief and panicked moment when Saul, fearing for his life in the desert, blurted out two unfamiliar names in a desperate attempt to save himself. Those names belonged to figures the original never showed and never explained.
The prequel took that throwaway moment and built two of its most important characters out of it. One of those names belonged to Nacho. The other belonged to Lalo Salamanca. Lalo became, for many viewers, the finest antagonist either show ever produced. Played by Tony Dalton, he was charming, funny, and warm on the surface, a man who could cook a meal and crack a joke and put everyone around him at ease, and lethal to the core underneath that warmth. The contrast made him uniquely terrifying because his pleasantness was genuine and his violence was sudden, and there was never a safe way to read which one was coming. More than that, Lalo was brilliant. He was the only figure in the entire saga who ever truly saw through Gus Fring's careful deceptions, who sniffed out the betrayal, investigated the hidden lab, and came closer than anyone to destroying the Kingpin's empire from the inside. When Gus finally moved to have him killed in an assault on his compound, Lalo survived, faked his own death, and returned in secret to hunt the man who had tried to murder him. The long game of wits between Lalo and Gus became one of the most gripping threads in the show. A contest between two masters of patience and deception. And it kept the audience genuinely uncertain about an outcome, even when the broad shape of the future was known. Lalo's death was the payoff of that long war, and it honored both men. Having infiltrated Gus's operation, Lalo cornered the Kingpin in the darkness of the unfinished underground lab, certain he had finally won. Gus, who had anticipated exactly this confrontation and hidden a weapon in the dark for precisely this moment, drew Lalo into the blackness, killed the lights, and shot him. The most formidable enemy Gus had ever faced was beaten not by force, but by foresight, by the same obsessive preparation that had defined Gus from the beginning. The scene closed a chapter that the original series had never even hinted at, resolving a war between two characters that Breaking Bad would not have known existed. This is where the achievement comes into full focus. The prequel did not merely recycle the dangers of the original. It built Nacho and Lalo, two of the most compelling antagonists in the entire franchise, out of a single, frightened line of dialogue. It deepened Hector from a silent symbol into a fully drawn tyrant and victim. It gave Gus the inner life the original never had time for. It transformed Mike from a quiet fixer into a tragic figure whose every crime was wrapped in love for his family. Where Breaking Bad had assembled a great rogues gallery, the spin-off assembled one at least its equal, and arguably richer, because it gave its villains the same patient interior attention it gave its heroes. The screen filled with people who were dangerous and human at once. And the danger meant more because the humanity was real. All of these people, the heroes and the villains alike, moved through a world that the show rendered with a visual and aural care unlike almost anything else on television. The cartel meetings in the desert, the gleaming sterility of the chicken restaurant,
the dim interiors, and the vast, empty landscapes. None of it looked accidental. The way the series chose to film its people and its places was itself a major part of why it surpassed its predecessor. And that craft, the look and the sound of the show, is where the next part of the story turns. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show deepened the villains it borrowed and built new ones from a single forgotten line, until its gallery of menace matched and arguably beat the originals. Mike, Nacho, Hector, Gus, and Lalo gave the danger a human face. The world they moved through was filmed like nothing else on television, and that craft is where the story goes next. Section 6. The Look and Sound of Saul. There is a difference between a show that is filmed and a show that is seen. Most television is shot in a way designed to disappear, the camera placed wherever it can capture the action cleanly so that nothing gets between the audience and the plot. The lighting is even, the framing is functional, the editing moves things along, and the viewer never thinks about any of it, which is exactly the point. A small number of shows work the other way around. They treat the camera as a storyteller in its own right, an instrument that can carry meaning the dialogue never speaks aloud. And they ask the audience to feel the world through the way it is photographed and heard. Breaking Bad had been one of those rare shows, famous for a visual daring that set it apart from almost everything around it. The spin-off inherited that sensibility and then pushed it further, until many people who studied such things came to regard it as the more beautiful and more disciplined of the two. The visual language of Breaking Bad had always been adventurous in ways that drew attention. The original series loved to place its camera in impossible spots, shooting scenes from inside everyday objects, from the bottom of containers, from angles no ordinary production would bother to attempt. The point of these choices was never decoration. They made the familiar strange. They reminded the audience that they were watching a constructed world. And they gave the show a restless, watchful energy. When the prequel arrived, it carried this same instinct in its blood. And rather than simply repeating the tricks of the parent, it refined them into something more composed and more confident. Where the original was kinetic and propulsive in its imagery, matching the velocity of its story, the spin-off was patient and painterly, matching the slowness that defined everything else about it. The head of the network that aired the show would later say that the series looked like nothing else on television, and for once, a promotional claim happened to be simply true. The most recognizable trick the show kept from its predecessor was the habit of shooting from inside things. The camera would peer out from within a coffee maker as it brewed, from inside a copier as its light swept across a page, from the depths of objects that had no business containing a point of view. These shots did more than show off. They created a constant, low-level sense that the world itself was watching the characters, that even the machines and the furniture were silent witnesses to the small crimes and quiet collapses unfolding in front of them. In a show about a man slowly becoming someone he could not take back, the feeling of being observed by everything, of leaving a trace in every object, gave the imagery a moral undertone the dialogue rarely needed to state. The objects of ordinary life took on a watchful significance, and the audience absorbed that significance without ever being told to. The compositions reached for something even more striking. The series became known for its love of symmetry and deep focus, for frames so carefully balanced they could be paused and hung on a wall. Characters were often placed small within enormous spaces, dwarfed by empty parking structures, vast desert horizons, sterile office corridors, and bare apartment walls. A single human figure pressed into the corner of a wide, dominating frame told a story all by itself. A story about insignificance and isolation.
about people who imagined they were in control of their lives while the world loomed indifferent and enormous around them. The slowness of the show gave these images time to land. A faster series would have cut away before the composition could do its work, but the spin-off was content to hold a shot, to let a character sit alone in a beautifully arranged emptiness until the loneliness of it seeped into the scene. The patience and the imagery worked together, each one making the other stronger. The setting itself became a character in the hands of the show's cinematographers. The landscape of New Mexico, all enormous skies and sun-bleached desert and distant mountains, had been part of the visual identity of the original, and the prequel made even fuller use of it. The vast, dry emptiness of the region gave the show a stage of overwhelming scale, against which its small human dramas played out. The color palette leaned into warm yellows and dusty oranges, the look of heat and dryness, and a place where the sun was always pressing down. Color carried meaning throughout, as it had in the original, where the clothing and surroundings of characters quietly shifted to mark changes in who they were becoming. The spin-off continued this careful attention to the meaning of color, using the warmth of the desert and the coldness of certain interiors to mark the temperature of the lives being lived inside them. Marshall Adams, one of the principal cinematographers across the run, helped give the series a consistency of vision that earned admiration from others in his field. And the show's images were recognized again and again by the people who understood best how hard they were to achieve. The signature form of the whole series, though, the technique most associated with it, was the montage. The show loved to compress time through long, wordless sequences set to music, and it elevated the montage from a convenient shortcut into a genuine art form. Jimmy filming his own low-budget commercials, scrambling to build a client base through cheap stunts and clever performances. The slow assembly of the underground laboratory, watched over many patient minutes. Mike conducting surveillance, building, waiting, the camera observing his careful process in loving detail. The extended sequence of Jimmy selling disposable phones from his car to a growing line of criminals. The same transaction repeated until its meaning became unmistakable. These montages told whole chapters of story without a word of dialogue, trusting images and editing and music to carry the weight. The slowness of the show, so worrying to the early skeptics, was exactly what made the montages possible. A series in a hurry cannot stop to watch a man do his work in full. A series built on patience can turn that watching into some of the most memorable footage it ever produces. Sound was the silent partner to all of this visual care, and the show treated it with the same seriousness. The series understood the power of near silence, the way an almost empty soundscape could make a viewer lean forward and hold their breath. The ambient hum of a fluorescent light, the distant noise of traffic, the small sounds of a room could carry more tension than any swelling score. The show used this restraint to extraordinary effect in the scenes involving Chuck and his illness, where the buzz and crackle of electricity became a sound of dread, the audio mirroring the torment in a sick man's mind. The score, composed by Dave Porter, who had also scored the original series, was used sparingly and precisely, often holding back where a lesser show would have poured on music to tell the audience how to feel. The restraint trusted the images and the performances to do the emotional work, and it let the rare moments of full musical force hit all the harder because they were so carefully rationed. Silence in this show was an instrument, and it was played with the skill of everything else. Even the choice of when to drain the color from the screen became a storytelling device. The sequences set in the far future, the scenes of the hunted man hiding under a new name in a distant city, were shot in stark black and white. And that single visual decision did an enormous amount of work. The absence of color signaled a different time and a different deadened state of being, a life stripped of the warmth and danger that had once filled the screen. The contrast between the rich, warm imagery of the past and the cold, gray imagery of the future told the audience exactly how far the man had fallen
before a single line was spoken in those scenes. The look of the show was not a surface over the story. It was the story, expressed in a second language that ran underneath the words. Behind all of these choices stood a creative team that included Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould, and a deep roster of directors and craftspeople who treated each episode as a chance to compose rather than merely to film. Gilligan himself directed some of the show's most visually ambitious hours, including the punishing desert journey that stretched across a single relentless episode, and the finale that brought the whole story to its close. The discipline of the imagery, the willingness to hold a shot, the courage to let silence sit. All of it reflected a group of people who believed that how a thing is shown matters as much as what is shown, and who had the patience and the skill to prove it across 6 seasons. When the two shows are compared on craft alone, a real argument emerges that the student outdid the master. Breaking Bad was a visual landmark, no question, a series that changed what television could look like and inspired countless imitators. The spin-off took that achievement as its starting point rather than its ceiling. It was more composed, more symmetrical, more confident in stillness, more willing to let a single image carry the weight of an entire scene. The propulsive energy of the original was thrilling, but the painterly patience of the prequel was, in the eyes of many who study cinematography, the more accomplished and the more difficult thing to pull off. To shoot a chase well is hard. To make a man sitting alone in an empty room feel like the loneliest sight on earth, through framing and light and silence alone, is harder. And the spin-off did it again and again. This craft, like so much else about the show, was admired by those who noticed and overlooked by the institutions that hand out the major prizes. The series collected nominations for its cinematography and its editing and its other technical achievements. And it watched those nominations turn into losses with the same grim consistency that defined its entire awards history. The beauty was real, and it was recognized by the eye, but it was never crowned. A pattern that would come to define the strange gap between how good the show was and how little official honor it received. That gap is a story in itself, and it is one of the strangest in the history of television. Before reaching it, though, there remains one visual choice that deserves far more than the passing mention it has received so far. Because it was not merely a matter of style. The decision to shoot the future in black and white was tied to a piece of storytelling so unusual that it gave the series a structural dimension the original never had. Hidden inside this prequel was a sequel, a glimpse of life after everything the audience already knew. And the gray, hunted figure at the center of those scenes carried a dread unlike anything else in the show. The story of that future, and of the broken man living inside it, is where this account turns next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The series turned the camera and the silence into storytellers, refining the daring of its predecessor into something more composed and, to many eyes, more beautiful. One visual choice stood apart from all the rest: the cold gray world of the future. Inside that drained and hunted place lived a sequel the original never imagined. And that future is where the story goes now. Section 7. The Black and White Future. The future has a way of haunting the present, even in stories. When an audience is shown where a character will end up, every moment that comes before it takes on a second meaning, a shadow cast backward from a fate already glimpsed. Storytellers have long understood the strange power of the flash forward, the way a single image of what is to come can change how every scene before it is felt. Most shows use the device sparingly, a brief tease at the start of a season, a glimpse of a wrecked future to be explained later. Better Call Saul did something far more ambitious and far a stranger.
It built an entire second timeline into the bones of the series, a window into life after everything the audience already knew. And it opened the very first episode of the show with a scene from that distant, drained, and frightening future. The scene was simple and unforgettable. A tired man in black and white moves through the routines of managing a Cinnabon in a shopping mall in Omaha, Nebraska. He works the counter, he watches the customers, he goes home to an empty apartment, and he lives in a state of permanent, low-burning fear. This man is the end of the road for Saul Goodman. After the events of Breaking Bad, with the law and worse closing in, the slick Albuquerque lawyer paid an expert in disappearances to erase him completely and build a new life from scratch. The expert, the same quiet professional who had helped vanish others in the world of the original series, delivered Saul to Omaha with a new name, Gene Takovic, and a new and unbearably small existence. The most flamboyant man in the franchise, the lawyer of the loud suits and the inflatable constitution, ended up hiding in a food court, terrified that someone might recognize his face. The choice to shoot these scenes in black and white was the visual signal of a structural decision that set the show apart from almost everything that came before it. The series was a prequel, telling the story of how Jimmy McGill became Saul Goodman in the years before Breaking Bad. The series was also, at the same time, a sequel, telling the story of what became of Saul Goodman in the years after Breaking Bad ended. It held 3 different periods of one man's life in its hands at once: the rise, the era the audience already knew, and the aftermath. And it moved between them with a confidence that no linear show could match. The original series had been a straight line from one point to another. The spin-off curled back on itself and reached past its own parent into a future the parent had never shown. And in doing so, it gave itself a dimension the original simply did not have. This structure performed a piece of magic that solved the deepest problem of the entire enterprise. The great weakness of any prequel is that the audience already knows the ending, and that knowledge drains away suspense. The future timeline turned that weakness inside out. Yes, everyone knew that Jimmy would become Saul because Saul existed in Breaking Bad. But nobody knew what happened to Gene. The fate of the hunted man in Omaha was the one corner of the entire story whose outcome the audience genuinely could not predict. The one place where real suspense still lived. By opening the show in the future and returning to it again and again, the series planted a question that the original could never answer, and that the prequel alone held the key to. The black and white scenes were not just atmosphere. They were the engine of genuine uncertainty in a story that otherwise had none. At the same time, the future cast its shadow back over everything else. Because the audience had seen where the man ended up, every warm and hopeful moment in the earlier timelines carried a quiet ache. A scene of Jimmy happy, Jimmy in love, Jimmy on the edge of something good, played with the knowledge that all of it led to a lonely apartment and a fake name and a constant fear of discovery. The future did not need to be on screen for its weight to be felt. It hung over the whole series like a sentence already passed, and the contrast between the warm color of the past and the cold gray of the future told the story of a fall more eloquently than any dialogue could. The life of Gene Takovic was a study in what survival without self actually looks like. He had kept his life and lost everything that made the life worth living. He moved through his days in a haze of caution, avoiding attention, flinching at anything that might expose him. At night, alone, he would secretly watch old recordings of his own television commercials from his lawyer days, staring at the loud, confident man he used to be, mourning him in private. The longing in those moments was the longing of a man who had erased himself to stay alive and could not bear the emptiness of what was left.
when a local cab driver recognized his face and quietly let him know it. The terror that washed over Gene was the terror of a man whose entire, fragile existence could collapse at any second. He had built a prison out of his own caution, and he lived inside it without parole. In the final stretch of the series, the future timeline expanded from brief glimpses into a full and devastating chapter. And it revealed the most chilling truth the show had to offer.
Pulled back toward the edge of exposure. With no one left to answer to and nothing left to protect, Gene did not retreat further into safety. He returned to crime. The old instincts of Slippin' Jimmy, the con artist from before the law and before everything, came roaring back. He began running schemes in Omaha, drugging and robbing men in bars, stealing identities, treating the people around him as marks. Without Kim, without his brother, without anyone whose opinion of him mattered, the worst version of the man was unleashed completely. The future showed that the decency Jimmy had always carried alongside his corruption had been held in place by the people he loved, and that stripped of them, what remained was something colder and crueler than the audience had ever seen. The chapter built toward a confrontation with a woman named Marion, the elderly mother of the cab driver Gene had fallen in with.
Marion, played by the comedy legend Carol Burnett in a role that traded entirely on her warmth, had come to trust Gene, to enjoy his company, to think of him as a friend. The casting was itself part of the franchise's long habit of taking beloved comic performers and turning them towards something dark. The same instinct that had cast a comedian as the tragic lead and another as his doomed brother. Marion, curious and a little lonely, eventually searched the man's real name on the internet and discovered exactly who he was: a wanted criminal hiding from justice. When she confronted him, Gene came terrifyingly close to silencing her by force, looming over a frightened old woman who had shown him nothing but kindness. He stopped himself, but the betrayal was complete. Marion looked at him and told him she had trusted him, and then she called for help, setting in motion the capture that the entire future timeline had been building toward. The man who had erased himself to escape the law was finally undone by the one thing he could never erase: his own nature. Underneath all of this lay the deepest idea the series ever explored, and it was an idea that only the future timeline could fully express. A person can change their name. They can change their face, their city, their job, their entire life. They can vanish so completely that the world believes they no longer exist. And none of it will change who they are underneath. Gene Takovic was proof that there is no disappearer skilled enough to separate a man from himself. The con artist was still the con artist in Omaha, just as he had been in Cicero and in Albuquerque, no matter what was printed on his identification. The inescapability of the self, the impossibility of truly outrunning the person you have made yourself into, was the thread that tied all three timelines together, and it could only be shown by following the man past the point where the original story had stopped. Breaking Bad ended with Walter White's death, a clean and final close. The spin-off went past death, in a sense, following its protagonist into a living erasure, and asking whether a man so hollowed out could ever find his way back to anything resembling himself. The structural daring of all this is hard to overstate. To run a prequel and a sequel inside the same series, to use the future to restore suspense to a story whose past was already known, to let the contrast between two timelines tell a story of moral collapse without a word. All of it was something the original series, for all its brilliance, never attempted, and arguably could not have attempted. The straight line of Breaking Bad was a thing of great power, but the looping, layered architecture of the spin-off was more ambitious and more intricate, a structure that asked more of its audience and rewarded them more deeply. In the realm of pure storytelling construction, the student had again outreached the master, building a shape no one had quite seen before, and making it carry the heaviest themes the franchise ever touched. A series this inventive, this beautiful, this rich in character and structure, ought, by any reasonable measure, to have been showered with the highest honors the medium can give. The performances were extraordinary, the writing was meticulous, the craft was admired by everyone who understood it, and the storytelling broke new ground. And yet, when the time came for the institutions of television to hand out their awards, something almost inexplicable happened, again and again and again. The show was noticed, nominated, and then passed over, year after year, until it had set a record that no creator would ever want to hold. The story of how a series this great walked away from every ceremony empty-handed is one of the strangest chapters in the entire history of the medium, and it is where this account turns next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By burying a sequel inside a prequel and shooting the future in cold gray, the show restored real suspense to a story whose past was known and revealed its deepest truth: that no one can outrun themselves. Such brilliance seemed certain to be honored. Instead, the series walked away from every ceremony with nothing, setting a record no one would ever envy. And that strange failure is where the story turns next. Section 8. The greatest snub in television history. Awards and greatness have always had a complicated relationship. The prizes that an industry hands out are supposed to mark the best of what it produces, and sometimes they do. But the history of every art form is littered with masterpieces that went home empty-handed, while lesser work collected the trophies. Voters are human. They are swayed by timing, by fashion, by the noise around a thing rather than the thing itself, by the simple fatigue of being asked to honor the same name year after year. The list of great novels that never won the major literary prizes, of great films passed over at the ceremonies, of great performances that lost to flashier ones, is long and a little heartbreaking. Television has its own version of this sad tradition, and in the entire history of the medium, no single example captures it more completely than what happened to Better Call Saul at the Emmy Awards. The bare numbers are almost difficult to believe. Across its 6-season run, the series was nominated for 53 Emmy Awards. It won none of them. Not a single one. The show set the record for the most Emmy nominations ever received by a program that never took home a trophy. And it did not merely break the old record, it shattered it. The previous holder of that unhappy distinction had been nominated around 25 times without a win. The spin-off more than doubled that figure, climbing to 53 nominations and 0 victories, a run of futility so extreme that the trade press took to calling it the most snubbed series of all time. To be nominated 53 times is itself a mark of enormous respect. To win nothing across all of them is a kind of cosmic bad luck that strains belief. The nominations were not scattered across minor technical categories where a loss might be easy to shrug off. The series competed at the very top of the ballot again and again in the categories that matter most. It was nominated for Outstanding Drama Series in essentially every year it was eligible, taking its place among the handful of programs judged the best the medium had to offer. Bob Odenkirk was nominated 6 times for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series, once for each season of his work, a sustained recognition of a performance that transformed a comic supporting player into one of television's great tragic figures. Ray Seahorn finally received nominations for her extraordinary work as Kim Wexler in the later seasons, after years of inexplicable neglect. Jonathan Banks earned nominations for his quiet, devastating turn as Mike, and Giancarlo Esposito was recognized for bringing Gus Fring to life. The writers, including Peter Gould and Gordon Smith, were nominated for crafting the show's most powerful hours. The institution clearly saw the quality. It pointed at the show every single year and said, "This is among the best."
And every single year, when the envelope was opened, the name read aloud belonged to someone else. The pattern of those losses had a cruel rhythm to it, and the final ceremonies made the heartbreak complete. In its last bids for the major prizes, the series ran headlong into the juggernaut of another acclaimed drama that was sweeping the field in its own final season. Better Call Saul lost Outstanding Drama Series to that competitor. Odenkirk lost the Lead Actor prize to one of its stars. Seahorn lost the Supporting Actress award to a performer from a different buzzy series. The writing nominations fell to the same dominant show. The pattern that had defined the entire run held firm right up to the very end. Always nominated, always present at the table among the best, always sent home without anything to carry. The phrase that kept attaching itself to the show was the old one about always being the bridesmaid and never the bride. And rarely has a phrase fit a situation so precisely. The contrast with the parent series sharpened the wound. Breaking Bad had not suffered this fate. The original won at the Emmys, and it won repeatedly. It took the prize for Outstanding Drama Series in its final seasons, claiming the top award the spin-off could never grasp. Bryan Cranston won the Lead Actor award multiple times for his portrayal of Walter White, a haul of victories standing in stark opposition to Odenkirk's run of 6 nominations and 0 wins. Aaron Paul won Supporting Actor honors more than once, and Anna Gunn won for her role as well. The exact total of the original's victories is sometimes counted differently depending on whether every technical category is included, with the figure most often cited sitting at 16 wins, though some tallies land lower. Whatever the precise number, the settled and undeniable fact is that the parent show triumphed where the child was shut out completely. The series, widely argued to be the better of the two, won nothing, while the one it had surpassed carried home armfuls of gold. How does something like this happen to a show this good? The answer lies partly in timing and competition, in the simple bad luck of when the series happened to exist. The years of its run, stretching across the second half of the last decade and into the early part of this one, were among the most brutally competitive in the history of television drama. The show spent its early seasons running against a fantasy epic that dominated the drama categories with the force of a cultural phenomenon, sweeping awards on a scale that left little room for anything else. As that giant faded, others rose to take its place, and the final seasons collided with another prestige drama that swept its own farewell. Layered on top of all this was the explosion of streaming, which flooded the field with new contenders and new money and new campaigns every year. The spin-off was always swimming against a current of louder, newer, more fashionable competition, and the current never let up. The quiet nature of the show worked against it in the awards race, as surely as it worked against it everywhere else. Slow, patient, restrained, the series did not produce the kind of flashy, attention-grabbing moments that voters often reward. It built its power through accumulation, through stillness, through the careful work of many hours. And that kind of greatness is harder to recognize in a single submitted episode than the explosive set piece of a showier rival. There was likely an element of fatigue as well. The show was reliably excellent year after year, and reliability can breed a strange kind of neglect. Voters may have come to take the quality for granted, to assume the series would always be there and always be good.
and to spend their votes on the newer thing demanding their attention. Excellence that arrives quietly and consistently is easy to overlook, precisely because it never makes a fuss. The circumstances of its airing did not help. The series ran on a cable network rather than on the premium outlet whose dramas dominated the awards conversation, and it lacked the enormous campaign machinery that the biggest contenders deployed every season. The show eventually found a vast new audience on a streaming service, but the prestige and the marketing muscle that often translate nominations into wins were never fully behind it. And there may have been a faint, unspoken bias against the very thing it was: a spin-off, a prequel, a show that some part of the industry could not quite bring itself to treat as fully original, even after it had proven its originality 100 times over. There is a resonance in all of this that is hard to ignore, a way in which the fate of the show rhymed with the story it told.
At its heart, this was a series about a man who spent his whole life craving recognition that the people he most wanted it from would never give him. Jimmy McGill worked and clawed and transformed himself in the desperate hope of earning the respect of his brother, and that respect never came, no matter what he achieved. The show itself worked and built and refined its craft across 6 remarkable seasons in pursuit of the highest honor its industry could bestow. And that honor never came either, no matter how good it became. The art and its fate fell into the same shape, a story of merit endlessly acknowledged and endlessly denied. There is something almost too fitting in the fact that a masterpiece about the pain of being undervalued was itself, in the most public way imaginable, undervalued. And yet the record of 53 losses has not diminished the show in the eyes of the people who love it. If anything, it has become part of the legend, a badge of strange honor, proof that greatness and trophies are not the same thing and never have been. The fans who watched the series rallied around its losses, treating each new snub as further evidence that the institutions had simply failed to keep up with the work, that the show was operating on a level the voters could not or would not see. The Emmy record did not make the series less great. It made it a permanent monument to the gap between quiet excellence and loud reward, a gap the show came to embody more completely than any other program in television history. This is, in the end, the purest possible illustration of the word at the center of this entire story. To surpass quietly is to be recognized without being crowned, to be acknowledged as great 53 times and rewarded 0, to climb to the very top of the ballot every year and watch the prize go elsewhere every time. Breaking Bad won loudly, its greatness stamped and certified by a row of golden statues. Its successor earned more nominations across its run and went home with nothing. Its greatness recorded in the nominations and erased in the results. A show can hardly surpass another more quietly than that, achieving a higher critical standing and a deeper body of work, while the official honors flow entirely to the predecessor. The Emmy record is not a mark against the show. It is the clearest evidence there is of exactly how silent its triumph was. The awards, of course, are only one measure of how a show lives in the world, and arguably not even the most important one. There is also the question of who actually watched, of how many people sat down for each episode, of the ratings and the numbers that networks live and die by. And here too, the story of Better Call Saul follows a pattern that explains its quiet ascent. A pattern of an audience that shrank even as the show grew greater, and of a second life that found it millions of new viewers long after most people had stopped paying attention. The numbers tell their own version of how a series surpassed its parent without anyone quite noticing, and those numbers are where this account turns next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 53 nominations and not a single win made the show the most honored loser in Emmy history, a quiet masterpiece the institutions could see but never crown. Its parent had triumphed where it was shut out. Beyond the trophies lies another set of numbers, the ratings and the audiences,
and they tell their own strange story of how the surpassing happened in near silence. Section 9. The numbers nobody was watching. There are many ways to measure a television show, and they rarely agree with one another. The number of people who tuned in on a given night, the trophies collected at the end of a season, the scores assigned by professional critics, the ratings handed out by ordinary viewers, the size of the conversation a show generates, the memes and the headlines and the water cooler talk. Each of these is a different kind of yardstick, and a single series can look like a triumph by one measure and a quiet disappointment by another. The gap between these measures is where the truth of a show's real standing often hides. And in the case of Better Call Saul, that gap explains the single most important word in any honest account of how it relates to its parent. The word is quietly, and the numbers are what give it meaning. The story of the show's audience began with a roar. When the series premiered in early 2015, it drew close to 7 million viewers, a figure that broke records for a scripted cable debut at the time, along with a remarkable showing among the younger demographic that advertisers prize most. The premiere scored a staggering audience and a record-setting number among adults 18 to 49, carried by the fanatical devotion that audiences had built up for the world of Walter White and Jesse Pinkman. The spin-off arrived on the largest possible wave, inheriting an enormous, eager audience that had loved the original and wanted more of its world. By the measure of opening night, no new show could have asked for a stronger start. What happened next was the opposite of what usually happens to a beloved series, and it is central to understanding the show's quiet nature. The audience did not grow. It shrank, steadily, season after season. After premiering to nearly 7 million viewers, the show declined fairly consistently from there, shedding roughly 750,000 viewers from one season to the next, with the first season averaging around 3 million, the second slipping to a little over 2 million, and the third falling to well under 2 million. The decline was gradual but relentless, the numbers ticking downward year by year, even as the quality of the show climbed higher and higher. By the time the fifth season premiered in 2020, it drew its smallest premiere audience yet, both in raw numbers and in the key demographic. The series that had opened to a record was, by its later years, playing to a fraction of the crowd that had once shown up. The truly revealing comparison is with the parent series, because Breaking Bad followed almost exactly the reverse path. The original had not opened to a record at all. It began modestly, with a relatively small audience that grew slowly over time. Breaking Bad averaged a little over 1 million viewers in its first season, and built only gradually from there, climbing past 1.5 million by its third season and continuing to rise. Where the spin-off started huge and faded, the original started small and swelled into a genuine cultural phenomenon, its audience snowballing as word of mouth and the rise of streaming caught new viewers up on what they had been missing. By the time Breaking Bad reached its finale, it was being watched by an audience many times the size of the one that had seen its early episodes. A true mass event followed by millions. The two shows crossed in the middle, one rising into a roar while the other settled into a hush. The meaning of this crossing is the heart of the whole story. Breaking Bad got louder as it went, growing into the kind of show that strangers discussed and headlines tracked. A series whose every twist became a national event.
Better Call Saul got better as it went, refining its craft and deepening its characters into what many came to regard as the superior work. And it did all of this in front of a steadily shrinking live audience. The cultural noise drained away from the spin-off at the very moment its quality was reaching its peak. The original surpassed its own beginnings loudly, in full view of a growing crowd. The successor surpassed the original quietly, in front of fewer and fewer people who happened to be watching it air. The live ratings, though, told only part of the story, and the part they left out is where the show found its real reach. The numbers that networks tracked on a given night badly undersold how many people were actually engaging with the series, because the way audiences watched television had changed.
Delayed viewing, recordings, and above all, streaming, had become the true measure of a show's life. And by those measures, the spin-off was far healthier than its modest live numbers suggested. The mid-season finale of the final season grew dramatically with a few days of delayed viewing, climbing well above its initial airing once recordings were counted. And viewership on the network's streaming service rose sharply over the season premiere, with the show standing as the single biggest driver of acquisitions in that service's history. The audience was there. It was simply watching, on its own schedule, in private, rather than gathering at a fixed hour the way audiences once had. The streaming afterlife went even further, and it produced numbers that genuinely surprised the industry.
In the run-up to its final season, the series climbed to the second spot on the national streaming rankings, accumulating hundreds of millions of minutes viewed. A notable achievement given that acquired titles, shows that originated elsewhere before landing on a streaming platform, typically do not chart as strongly as a service's own originals. People were re-watching the entire series to prepare themselves for the ending, pouring through 6 seasons in the quiet of their own homes. The show that played to a shrinking live audience was, on demand, drawing a vast and devoted one. The reach was enormous. It was simply silent, spread across countless individual screens rather than concentrated into a single, noisy broadcast moment. When the conversation turns from how many watched to how good they thought it was, the picture sharpens further and reveals exactly why the surpassing was so quiet. Among professional critics, the spin-off edged ahead of its parent.
On the major review aggregator, the spin-off holds a critics' approval rating of around 98%, slightly higher than the original score in the mid-90s. The critical consensus was extraordinary across the board. By one count, 51 of the show's episodes earned a perfect critics score. Every season was certified fresh, and even the series finale sat near the very top of the rankings. By the measure of the people whose job it is to judge television, the student had pulled narrowly ahead of the master. Honesty requires acknowledging that this lead was narrow and that not every measure agreed with it, because that disagreement is itself part of the quiet. Among ordinary viewers, rather than professional critics, the two shows were nearly tied, with the original holding a slight edge in audience approval. The original's audience score sat a hair above the spin-offs, the two separated by the finest of margins.
On the largest public ratings database, where mass audiences register their verdicts, the gap widened in the parents' favor. The spin-off earned a rating in the high 8 range, a tremendous score that placed it among the most admired shows of its era. Viewers consistently praised it as fantastic and as one of the best shows of recent years, while still tending to place it just below its predecessor, frequently describing it as not quite as good as Breaking Bad, but remarkably close. The original, by contrast, sat higher still, anchored among the very top series in the database's entire history, home to individual episodes regarded as untouchable peaks of the medium. Its most celebrated hour-long held a near-perfect score and is routinely called the summit of prestige television. This split is the most important fact in the entire argument, and it must be stated plainly rather than smoothed over. The claim that Better Call Saul surpassed Breaking Bad is not a settled universal verdict. It is a contested one. It is the verdict of a large body of critics who gave the spin-off the higher professional score. It is the verdict of a devoted faction of fans who found its character work and its tragedy deeper and more affecting than the originals. Even the publications weighing the two against each other
acknowledged that some fans rate the spin-off higher, while treating the question as a genuine debate between two fantastic shows rather than a matter anyone has truly closed. The mass audience, meanwhile, still tends to crown the parent, still ranks it a notch above, still treats Breaking Bad as the louder, more universally celebrated achievement. Both things are true at once, and the tension between them is precisely what the word quietly is built to capture. Put all the numbers together, and the shape of the surpassing becomes unmistakable. The spin-off drew fewer live viewers and saw its audience shrink while the originals grew.
It won no awards while the original collected many. It earned a slightly higher critical score, but a slightly lower mass audience rating. It built a vast and passionate following, but a quieter one, expressed through streaming and devotion rather than through ratings records and cultural saturation. The original surpassed its own humble origins in the loudest way imaginable, becoming a phenomenon that defined an era of television. The successor surpassed the original in the quietest way imaginable, climbing higher in the estimation of critics and connoisseurs and the people who watched it most closely, while never seizing the mass crown, the trophies, or the cultural noise that the parent commanded. To surpass quietly is to win the arguments that happen in small rooms and lose the ones that happen in stadiums.
It is to be the choice of the people who study the craft and the people who watched most carefully, while the broader world keeps handing the louder prize to the show that came first. The spin-off achieved exactly this. It became, for a substantial and serious body of opinion, the better of the two. And it did so without ever announcing it, without a single golden statue, with a shrinking broadcast audience and a slightly lower popular rating. Its victory recorded in critical scores and in the testimony of its most devoted viewers, rather than in any official coronation. A show could hardly outclimb its predecessor more softly than that. The final piece of any verdict, though, is not a number at all. It is the ending. A show that has built its entire meaning around a man's slow transformation, around the gap between who he was and who he became, lives or dies by how it chooses to close that gap. The original had ended with a death in the snow and a life's work in ruins.
The spin-off had to find a way to end the story of a man who had already lost everything, already vanished into a fake name, already proven that he could not outrun himself. What it chose to do in its final hour, the confession it placed in its hero's mouth, and the strange and bitter redemption it offered him, is where the entire question of whether the student truly surpassed the master finally comes to rest. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The spin-off shed viewers as it grew greater and won no prizes, yet climbed higher among critics and the devoted, surpassing its parent in small rooms, while the louder crowns stayed with the original. That is the quiet shape of its victory. Everything now rests on the ending, on a confession and a strange redemption, and that final hour is where the story closes. Section 10. Saul Gone. An ending is a verdict on everything that came before it.
A story can be brilliant for hours and still betray itself in its final minutes. And a story that has wandered can redeem itself entirely in how it chooses to close. The last hour of a long series carries a weight that no single episode in the middle could ever bear, because it must answer the questions the whole journey has been asking, and it must decide what all the suffering and striving finally meant. The original series had ended with its hero dying among the equipment of the empire he built, bleeding out on his own terms, having beaten his enemies and secured his fortune. A conclusion as explosive and uncompromising as the man himself. The spin-off faced a stranger and harder problem. Its protagonist had already lost everything before the finale even began. He had lost his brother, his wife, his name, his face, and his freedom. He was a man hiding in a fake life who had already proven he could not outrun himself.
The question was not how to bring him down,
because he was already as low as a person could go. The question was whether anything could lift him, even a little, on the way out. The road to the ending ran through one last performance of the only skill the man had ever truly mastered. Captured at last and dragged back to face justice for his years at the side of Walter White, he did what he had always done. He worked the system. Facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars, he negotiated, charmed, and maneuvered the prosecution into a deal that bordered on the miraculous, talking them down to a sentence of just 7 years and arranging small comforts for himself along the way. It was the ultimate expression of Saul Goodman, the slippery operator who could talk his way out of anything, about to escape real consequence one final time after a lifetime of harm.
The man who had ruined so many lives was on the verge of paying almost nothing for it, and he was smiling about it. What broke the performance open was the same force that had defined the best and worst of him all along. He learned that Kim had come forward. She had filed a sworn statement telling the truth about Howard Hamlin's death, exposing herself to ruin in order to stop carrying the lie any longer. She would be present in the courtroom. The knowledge that the one person who had ever truly seen him had chosen honesty over self-protection reached something in him that no threat or sentence ever could. With Kim watching from the gallery, the man who had spent his whole life avoiding the truth made a choice that no one in the room expected. He threw the deal away. Standing before the court, he abandoned the 7-year arrangement he had so carefully built, and he began to confess.
Not the careful, lawyerly confession that minimizes and deflects, but a full and devastating accounting of what he had done. He took responsibility for his role in Walter White's empire, refusing the shelter of the story that he had been a frightened bystander coerced into helping. He admitted the scale of his own choices and his own guilt. And then he went somewhere the deal had never required him to go, somewhere only his conscience could have pushed him. He confessed about Chuck. He admitted that he had played a part in his brother's death, that there had been a moment when he could have acted differently and chosen not to, that the guilt he had buried for years was real and was his. He stopped calling himself Saul Goodman. He told the court his name was Jimmy McGill, reclaiming the identity he had spent years trying to escape. In exchange for the truth, he accepted a sentence of 86 years, trading a near-total escape for a near-total punishment, choosing to pay everything rather than nothing. The meaning of that choice had been prepared by a quiet motif woven through the show's final stretch, a question that several characters were asked at different points in their lives. If a person had a machine that could carry them through time, where would they go? And what would they change? Each character's answer revealed who they were. Mike, the tired professional, said he would return to the day he first crossed the line into corruption, the day everything began to go wrong. A regret so specific and so heavy that it had hollowed him out for years.
Walter White asked the same kind of question, scoffed at the premise entirely, refusing to engage with regret, treating the idea of changing his path as a foolish fantasy, and turning the conversation instead toward an old business grievance, his ego intact even in reflection. And Chuck, in a flashback to a quieter time, had told his brother that it was never too late to choose a different road, that a person could always change course, an offer of grace that Jimmy had brushed aside without a second thought. The time machine was never real, of course. The only machine that could undo a wasted life was honesty, the willingness to look squarely at what one had done and to name it out loud. In the courtroom, choosing 86 years over 7, Jimmy finally stepped into that machine in the only way a person actually can, by telling the truth
and accepting the cost.
The contrast with the ending of the original series could not be sharper, and it is the heart of the entire case this story has been building. Walter White died unrepentant. In his final hours, he had admitted, at last, that he did it all for himself, that the empire and the danger had made him feel alive. But that admission came in private, and it changed nothing about how he chose to go out. He died having won, in his own terms, surrounded by the machinery of his triumph, having killed his enemies and arranged for his fortune to reach his family. He never stood before anyone and submitted to judgment. He never chose to pay. He took control of his own ending and went out on his feet, master of his fate to the last. It was a magnificent and terrible conclusion for a magnificent and terrible man, and it asked the audience to admire him even as it condemned him.
Jimmy McGill chose the opposite path. And in choosing it, he completed a moral journey the original series had deliberately declined to take. Where Walt seized control, Jimmy surrendered it. Where Walt died proud, Jimmy lived ashamed and honest. Where Walt secured his freedom and his money, Jimmy threw away his freedom to secure something he valued more: the chance to be seen by the one person whose eyes mattered as the man he could have been, rather than the man he had become. The redemption was real, but it was quiet and costly and internal. A redemption measured in decades of prison rather than in any external victory. Walter White went out in a blaze of fire and gunpowder. Jimmy McGill went out in a confession and a closed cell door. The two endings embodied the two shows with almost unbearable precision. Loud triumph against quiet repentance. A man who beat the world against a man who finally beat himself.
The final scene gathered all of this into a single image that reached back to the very beginning.
In prison, the man who had reclaimed the name McGill found himself surrounded by inmates who knew him only as the famous criminal lawyer, who recognized his face and chanted the old advertising slogan that had once filled his television commercials, the very phrase that had given the show its name. The persona he had finally killed still echoed around him, a ghost he would carry for the rest of his life. And then Kim came to visit. Listed still as his attorney, she was able to stand with him in the visiting area, and for a few minutes, the two of them simply existed in the same space again. He found a cigarette. They shared it, passing it back and forth, leaning against the wall in silence. And the image was a direct echo of the very first time the audience had ever seen them together. Two people sharing a cigarette in the gloom of a parking structure in the show's opening hour.
The story had traveled 6 seasons and arrived back at its beginning. The same two people. The same small ritual. Everything and nothing changed. As Kim turned to leave, Jimmy raised his hand in the small finger gesture that had always passed between them, a private signal of recognition and farewell. She walked out through the fence and was gone, and he watched her go. The title of that final episode was a quiet pun, the kind the show loved. The words could be heard as a simple goodbye, a so long, and they could be heard as a plain statement of fact, that Saul was gone. Both readings were true. The persona of Saul Goodman was finished, dissolved in the courtroom the moment Jimmy reclaimed his real name, and with it went the lie the man had hidden inside for years. What remained was a prisoner with a 50-year smile and a clear conscience, a man who had lost his freedom and recovered his self, sharing one last cigarette with the woman who had always known exactly who he was. The ending offered no triumph, no escape, no fortune secured. It offered only the truth and the strange peace that comes from finally telling it. This is where the question that has run through this entire story comes to rest. The claim that the spin-off surpassed the original is, as we have seen, a contested one, debated rather than settled.
the verdict of critics and devotees rather than of every viewer or every awards body. The mass audience still tends to crown the parent. The trophies all went to the parent. The cultural noise belonged to the parent. But on the single measure that a finale exists to provide, the measure of whether a story can complete the moral journey it set out to tell, the spin-off did something its celebrated predecessor never even attempted. It let its hero choose honesty over freedom. It let a broken man reclaim his name and accept his punishment and be truly seen. It found a redemption that the original, for all its brilliance, had no interest in offering. Because Walter White was a story about a man who refused to repent, and Jimmy McGill became a story about a man who finally did. For the large and serious body of opinion that holds the spin-off to be the greater of the two shows, this ending is the closing argument. Breaking Bad gave the world one of the most unforgettable conclusions in television history: a man dying as he lived, unbowed and unrepentant. And it earned its place in the canon 100 times over. Better Call Saul answered with something harder and quieter: a man choosing to be diminished in order to be honest. A redemption paid for in decades behind bars and witnessed by a single pair of loving eyes. The original surpassed every expectation loudly, becoming a phenomenon that defined an era. The successor surpassed the original quietly, climbing higher in the estimation of those who watched most closely, while never seizing the noise or the prizes, and then completing its hero's journey in a way the parent never chose to. Whether that quiet completion makes it the better show will be argued for as long as people watch either one. That the argument exists at all, that a spin-off built around a comic relief lawyer became a genuine and serious rival to one of the greatest dramas ever made, is itself the proof of how far this unlikely series traveled, and how softly, and how completely it earned its place beside the show that gave it life. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.